have like the fresh air and the sense of, health for children and sunshine and fresh air against tuberculosis and against children's mortality and morbidity was really, really important. So these were highly valued, and so this is what the report is saying. And then you have the individual children. So you see that they are telling you, we work with them collectively, we work with them individually. In the later pictures of the 1950s, you no longer have the collective, you only have individual children when they move on to children's mental health. So it is very much what the picture conveys. What does it show? What does it convey? Right? Here you have a child learning how to eat properly. Look how clean, which is an impossibility almost. I mean, you wonder, they just put the baby on like 1 minute before the shot or something, right? Here you have two girls, a lot of girls, by the way, learning how to button themselves or unbutton their clothes. So they become autonomous individuals, right? Responsible, autonomous, clean. Get that. And here you have the telephone at the time as a new technology. As a new technology. So what the report is saying is we also teach the children, we involve them in the new technologies, in the latest developments. So we're scientifically oriented as well as we're humanistically oriented. We know about child development and we know about autonomy of individuals. Now, if you look at it as an object, which is what my colleague immediately saw, photographer, look at the way the images are displayed. Does this remind you of anything? This was actually a very well-known, and it still is, but was before, model for photo albums, that you would have a family album displaying the picture in that way. So the mother could, Kodak had all sorts of little, you could buy a little Kodak camera and you can make your own family album at home, mothers, And so then you would have this kind of display rather than, the police kind of display. This is a quite different display. So the display is conveying something that the reporter doesn't actually say in the text, which is we're family oriented. We actually create a new family for the children. It's not saying we create the family that they have or we continue with the family that they have. It's not saying that. It doesn't go as far as that. It may not even want to go there. But it's saying we, in the service, in the program, create a sense of family. Just in the way the pictures are assembled and they are displayed. Okay. You think I'm stretching it, but there's actually, you may think I'm stretching it, but there's actually something about that. I don't have the magic touch. Voila. So this notion of assemblage of text creates a rich repertoire. You have a complementarity and not a triangulation. You have multiple voices, even within a single source text. You can analyze speeches and see that they diverge. For instance, we have a speech that's much more social reform oriented, and the other that's more imperialist. And you can actually read that as you look at the documents. So that organizations are places of debate and dissension. History is about debate. It's not just about what was in a smooth kind of a way, right? And the photographs function as objects with their own logic that may escape or extend the intention of their makers. They're not simply merely illustrations. They act, they do something. Okay, now the second project, the current one, starts from the photographs, right? And we looked at the range of representation of children in public spaces, in the streets, in the back lanes, on stoops. Okay. And what activities were they playing, were they working, were they holding other children, what were they doing, what were they doing? Were they witnessing, were they observing, what were they doing? And the kind of portrayals of children. And then we take the photographic production, just like we did with the text. Photographer, who was the photographer? What was the commission? What was the objective? What were the objectives? What was the audience? What was the genre of the image? And then the process of use and circulation of the object over time. So this is kind of the systematic approach that we use. Now, pictures. Okay. This is a photographer, William James. He was actually of British origin, came to Canada and worked for the media, worked for newspapers. He did not work for the city, unlike Goss that we saw before. And he represents children in one of the neighborhoods, in the poor neighborhood, the ward. And look at the way the children are represented. You have kind of the poor child, you had a disabled child, but you had also children who are sort of okay, semi-okay, some kind of destitute. You have a kind of a mix, right? You have very little about the context. You have much more the children as types. And you have children taking care of other children. And if you compare the Goss image, that was a commission by the city, which had nothing to do about children. The focus was not children. The focus was the street and the necessity to destroy, to raise this block of buildings to make way for the registry. So it was really an urbanistic project. It had nothing to do with children, but children were there because they were everywhere. So it's the unintended subject of this picture. And here you have, it's the intended subject of the picture. It's children in a poor slum neighborhood. Okay? And the representations of children are actually quite different images. But that's kind of the line of work that we're looking at. And these are images that were used a lot by Children's Aid Society. You have a newspaper girl. Usually they were newspaper boys, but in some cities you also had newspaper girls. And you have the representation of barefoot and the kind of clothing that they have. They are different clothing. And these are images actually of a demonstration day at the new playground on Elizabeth Street, same neighborhood. And it's a demonstration day, so that some of the children are very well dressed. And then if you look at some, I won't use the red thing. If you look at some of the children here, some are barefoot, and they look, the ones who observe the other children making the demonstration game look actually different. So the question is, was there a diversity of children who actually used the playground, who actually was the observer, and who actually, in fact, never used those playgrounds and continued to play in the street? So that's a different kind of a question. And this is an iconic picture that's been used and repeatedly used about the 1913, the Elizabeth Street playground, which in fact only existed for about maybe 15 years and then was raised again to make way for large hospitals. So it wasn't like this existed forever. And then we collected text. We collected the slum report, we collected administrative text, newspapers, satirical papers, secondary literature. And we looked at the relationship between text and image. So some of the findings at the government commissions and the journalistic intentions vary. They really are not the same. You don't see children the same way. Photographers are different, and they have a preference for particular photographic genres, so that makes a difference. Social reform literature actually has used selective images, and I will show you a couple of those, to make an argument for policy or program change, so that images were used consciously and deliberately. And J.J. Kelso was a major Canadian figure who created the Children's Aid Society and child protection and children's playground movement and all sorts of things at the time. He used painting first from England and then used photography that were made by other people. So this is a photograph that was made by Goss, the first photographer, of children. This was a Jewish neighborhood, but also Irish neighborhood, and also before had been an African Canadian, if you want, before Canada existed, neighborhood. And so here, the title says, Need for More Playgrounds. Now, the original picture did not have this kind of caption. It was commissioned by the health department and showed particular kind of back lanes and backyards and the conditions to make way for sanitation. The social reform movement picks up these images and creates an argument for playgrounds. This is the original caption, the rear of 111 and 113 Ontario Street, south of Queen Street. Queen Street, of course, is the colonial, is the imperial connection. You have Queen Street and King Street in Canada everywhere. Okay, and then you have the reform comment. This picture shows a lean-to, which is the rear entrance. 5 children were playing immediately around the toilet. In the dark portion of the picture, the toilet can be observed. But this is added to the picture. This was not the original picture. And here's this is Central Neighborhood House, which is one of the major settlement houses that was created exactly at the same time, around 1911, in the same neighborhood, to cater to the same children and the same families. And they make the case about the children are waiting in water and as a welcome relief in the small backyard playground during hot summer. So they really need large playgrounds. And therefore, the picture later of Elizabeth Street Playground. It was really a movement, a social movement. Okay, so now as to conclude, what we're trying to do now is transmit what we've understood, or what we've learned, or parts of what we've learned through exhibit format. If this is visual, can we then use a visual format to transmit what we've understood, and not just a text, if you want? Okay. So there's going to be an exhibit that will run 6 months in Toronto at the City of Toronto Archives, where the visual is primary, and we're sort of discussing now what to do with text, whether it's to create newspapers or broadsheets that people can take with them, reproducing kind of, or listening to text, exactly, and people reading the text. That's a very nice idea, actually. And creating and how to create an immersive experience so that people don't look at them as just the past, but have a sense of, it's coming to me. And so one of the ways is to create very large images, like very large. So it's there about people size, so that you have a sense of an encounter as a person, if you want. And one of the ways we'll do it in Canada, in Toronto, is to have the picture. This is a new technology. So the curator is very excited about that, is to use a 2.5D. So it's not 3D, but 2.5D. And what does that mean is that you layer kind of different pieces of the image so that you can have parts of the image that start moving, and the background moves as well. So you have the sense, if you see the children in the first image, the 2 girls and the 2 boys in the background, that some of them will start moving a bit towards you or away from you. And so it'll be more like an address, because we're into interactive things nowadays. And we want to reproduce the material side, so have objects, have marbles and hopscotch, and maybe have competition of children creating new hopscotch and new words in the hopscotch, like slum, like waif, like all sorts of words that were used at the time, and words that are used today. Okay. And create juxtaposition between past and present. Oh yes, the juxtaposition, the curator is going to be filming at the beginning of October a film with children today in the same location, the same neighborhood, although it has disappeared, but more or less the same angle and very close to the original image of children today who are going to be standing in the street and playing in the street without the adult, or their parents will be close by, which is different from the original, but without adults, to see whether the viewer isn't struck by the fact that, children today in the street without adults. And yet in the past, this was very common. People were told, go out and play in the streets. Go in the streets, go. So that's going to be happening at the beginning of October. Okay, so photographs are not neutral. They are not a view from nowhere or from everywhere, but they're the product of constructions. And the materials are to be interpreted critically in relation to the social context of production and of reception, and to the textual and image-based discursive context they are part of. This is a very lovely book, The Social Construction of What, by Ian Hacking, who's a philosopher, a social philosopher. And in it, he has different cases, including a case of children's mental health or child abuse. And he's not saying that the social construction doesn't mean, from his perspective, that it did not exist. It does exist. But there is a feedback loop, there's a loop of representation that once we see children, for instance, in a particular way, we then act towards them in particular ways, and they in turn internalize, or we as children internalize how people look at us. And this is true for any group, any identity, any sense of self and other. So this is a lovely book, which by Harvard University Press, which is a lot of fun, actually, which I highly recommend. Okay, now Brighton. What about Brighton? Well, this is Brighton's day, Brighton's week. Julia Winkler, who's my team member, who teaches photography and media studies at the University of Brighton, is now currently exhibiting 9 panels at the Jubilee Library. If you walk into the Jubilee Library, and I went yesterday, you can actually see those 9 panels. They're mounted onto the windows. So from the inside, if you go into the cafe of the library and you're looking outward, you will see 9 panels of children that were done based on historical archives of Carlton Hill, Brighton. And I will show you some images. They were commissioned, because of course we ask the same questions, by the Environmental Health Department of Brighton, by the Borough Council in the 1930s. There are also pictures of the 1950s. They were done by professional photographers, not lay. So the Vaudreuil studio was commissioned by the council. And Selma Montfort, who's an anthropologist, who I think is 91 or something, living in Brighton, actually had put together a collection of images that were given to her in a brown paper bag after they had been lost for years. And she then salvaged the photographs, invited people of Brighton who had grown up in Brighton and who could recognize something about the images, not themselves necessarily, but the atmosphere of the images, to talk and to be interviewed. And she put together books that you might know, which are called Backyard Brighton. And there's not one book, there are several books of Backyard Brightons with photographs and actual text. The photographs of the period, the text are people who are adults now, elderly adults now, and who talk and remember. So the exhibit is going on, it's happening now at the Jubilee Library until Sunday. It will be taken down on Sunday, so it's rather ephemeral. It's a pop-up exhibit, that is called. And on Thursday evening, and I have postcards which I'd like to leave here and distribute to you, Julia is going to be projecting onto the wall of the old Circus Street School building, which also happens to be the photography department building right now, which is going to be demolished. And it's one of the last buildings of period to remain. On the outside wall, she will be projecting, other people will be projecting some of images. And we'll be presenting also at the Visual Methodology or Visual Methods Conference, which is taking place in Brighton on Friday morning. But I really invite you to go and see the Jubilee, and let me show you some pictures, the Jubilee Library exhibit, and to see the projection, which will take place at 8:45. And there may be a truck with soup. You know, the soup truck is invited to also provide soup, or you can buy soup on the soup truck, so I hear, until 9:30. So free, of course. So this is one of the images which has been a bit squished here. These are actually children who, the text in the Backyard Brighton says, somebody says, I remember when we were children, when we came back from school, we would go to the bakery, and if they had breadcrumbs left, we would bring them back home into pillowcases. We put them in the pillowcases and bring them back home. So all of a sudden you have a bit of text. Somebody remembers that, seeing one of the images, which is quite remarkable. And this was on the wall, which says, fascism means hungry children. So this was obviously more recent writing. It wasn't necessarily written then. This is it. I have exhausted my voice and exhausted my time, and maybe exhausted you in the process.
Elsie Whittington. We were talking on our table about this idea of kind of the link between photos and the visual and social work, and particularly thinking about if we're linking history with the present, how the visuals kind of worried about a lot at the moment. If we think about social media as a space, as an archive and a present day archive,
that's a nice
how
way to put it,
are these pictures kind of curated, managed, regulated? And we were then also reflecting a bit on kind of the ethics of the photo distribution that's happening, but also kind of thinking about this idea of the staged photo and the non-staged photo.
Right.
In that the non-staged, the everyday photo is
Right.
probably more regulated and kind of quashed than a staged photo that is put out to be the publicity for something. So it's like the regulation of how we view children and young people, or how they're viewed. So we're just kind of reflecting on that. It'd be interesting to hear what you think in terms of the links of of these kind of present day, everyday archives of social media, YouTube, things like that, and with the ones that you're working with.
Lovely, thank you. Should we take a couple more thoughts, just as Adrienne said, thoughts for the group as well as for Adrienne, that then we can extend a bit further. What were the buzz on these two tables about? Gillian.
I'm Gillian Rouge, social work here. Well, what were we troubled by? I suppose we were troubled a bit by how interpretation is made, whose interpretation, and the relationship between the photographs and the text. So my comment was I kind of wanted to see the photographs embedded in the text, to see how that relationship worked. And so then, yes, to what extent the staging can be more clearly seen, really, in relation to what's being promoted through the work. Was there anything else?
Did you mean that in the original context in which you're saying that certain pictures were then used within certain texts in order to, rather than Adrienne, the way that Adrienne and colleagues have used pictures and created their own text?
The former, I think.
Good. All right. Any other thought or two from this table?
My name's Tony Gamage. An artist, not a social worker. I don't know if that's relevant or not. But I think we were thinking about. It's not just the fact that children are on the streets anymore, but you can't really photograph them anymore anyway because of the sort of implications of that. But we're also thinking of, I suppose, just where you can't take cameras. And where things aren't documented, I was thinking detention centres. You don't know what the hell's going on, really. And so there's a kind of contradiction, a paradox, the sort of usefulness of cameras and the sort of danger of them, sort of links with that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your questions. They're all great questions. Let me start with sort of this table and then go to the two sets of comments here that I think go together. I mean, they all go together, but let me just organize the sequence that way. About the photo text interpretation, I think it is important, as you said, the group you have said, to show not, I mean, here you have a quick summary of several years of work. So you get, what you're getting is my staging of the research, which is already a particular kind of interpretation or a particular kind of emphasis I'm trying to make. Right? If I were to tell the story differently, I would stage it differently, absolutely. So that there is no, I mean, from a constructivist, social constructionist perspective, constructivist being more cognitive, social constructionist being more institutional, social, as well as construction, there is always a social construction at work. And right now, I am creating the social construction of the work. Indeed, there's pictures, I would need to say one of the ways of doing a presentation like this would be to take one object, for instance, the photographs, and say where were they located. And they were in the annual reports. The annual reports were themselves published, were printed professionally, which means that the women, because the club of women, actually paid somebody and paid commercially, so put part of their budget into that, which is quite important, rather than having in-house to create a published text. And when they had some money in the 20s, then they actually added black and white photographs in separate pages, but they were part of the report. In the 30s, when they had no more money, then there are no more images. So it's not, there's an economic to this as well now. But absolutely, you are right that it's important to put together what does the image look like in the context of the text? What does the text look like in the context of the object? What does the object look like in the context of the practices? What is the context of society in the context of the discussion between the women in the city? The first project was reported in the British Journal of Social Work in 2011 And so you have a little bit more context about that and how we worked. But again, we did separate out, like the archivists have done, the photographs from the text. Whereas if you work with newspaper articles, you want to look at the image, and then you want to look at the image in the text, and you want to look at not only the text of the article in the discourse analysis, but what are the advertisements all around? What are the things which consciously, unconsciously kind of reverberate in the picture? So you can have like an advertisement for funding children, for adopting children abroad, next to something else which is highly wealthy, and you're saying, okay, so how do these things come together? And who is the audience of this magazine? And what is the appeal, and how people appeal to? So it is a multi-layered text. And by doing it like this in bits and pieces, I've actually simplified and distorted and created a particular story. So absolutely. Now to come up to you, two questions of today, both about social media and the curating. I like the way you put this, the curating and the managing and the regulating of images. Is there anything that takes us back to the discussion about what is experience? And is experience something spontaneous, or is it spontaneous and socially created and culturally created? You know, like selfies, there's a practice of selfies. Well, once upon a time, there wasn't a practice of selfies. You took pictures out, but there was always a person who wasn't in the picture. And you knew who that person was if you knew the group. It was, of course, so-and-so who always take pictures of the group. Right? Now, with the selfie, it's me, I. The language has changed. We now say me, I, as if the I is not enough. You have to say me, I. So you center yourself doubly, twice. And then you do a selfie, and then you do, and then you have a selfie with a pole so that you can take a larger context. So all these practices of self-representation and circulation of images that have created a lot of havoc at the same time are shaped by the culture. So in some ways, they are regulated, if you want it that way. They're shaped by expectations. They're certainly generationally shaped and social, cultural context shaped. There are still people who do not want to be photographed. And not just because it's not legally permissible, but who feel that you're trying to capture something of them in spite of them. And there is something about that. There is something that is being done to people. Now, one could argue, but if you engage in a relationship with someone and you get to know them, then taking a picture and asking them whether they would like a picture is a whole different activity. There is a camera, but it's a technology, but it's a different activity. So what do we mean by capturing somebody through an image? Or what's a photo shoot? And the word shoot in English is quite violent. So there is something about that. That's not quite as gentle as it sounds, right? Or not necessarily as gentle as it sounds. Of course, there are lots of participatory research projects now where we ask people to take their own photographs. And they take photographs of very different things. And it may not be the things that the researcher is most interested in. It's like, why this picture? Why this? Like this corner of the table, of this, But the point is, this is what's important, and this is what the conversation is about. So there is an interactive piece about involving people and taking pictures and eliciting pictures and eliciting a conversation. So I think the question about is there an interaction really does make a difference, and what kind of interaction. Ethics is also about relationships. It's not just the prescriptive legal side, which exists also, which has sanctions and consequences, but it is about what are we trying to do here when we take a picture. So the question is anything not regulated? Well, you could say that artists try to do something different. They try to make a commentary on society in different ways. Or graffiti artists make a commentary on society. Right? Or the Bansky exhibit in Liverpool, I don't know where, is trying to make a commentary. But one could also argue that within the artistic world, you also have a culture. You also have cultures, not one culture, cultures of picture taking, of picture making, of representation. So it's not like there is one that's kind of outside of any kind of communication context. But what communication context or contexts are being played in? And that's what the reflective side. And maybe that's what's the frustrating side. It's that, we don't believe in spontaneity anymore. I mean, everything is always mediated, it's always regulated, it's always, and that's the question. But at times you find images which actually are a little bit different. They're a little bit in between, or they do not tell the single story. The image we chose, the first image you saw, we chose because it is ambiguous, because it doesn't tell you a particular story about who these children are, what they are doing. Are they looking? Are they observing? Are they witnessing? If I say they witness something, it gives them much more power and agency than if I say they're loitering. The same image was used in 2001 in an exhibit about children's play, the same image, but with a new caption that said loitering. Now, the minute you put the text, loitering, the text, as Derrida would say, drives the picture. The text is more powerful. It forecloses the story. It kind of ties it together and says that's what they're doing, they're loitering. Loitering is, small deviance, which becomes big deviance, which becomes criminality. This is a very old story that was, in the 19th century, we had these kinds of stories. But why loitering? They're standing there. What do we mean by loitering? We mean something that's not okay, that they should not be doing. So there's a lot that goes into that bit of text, which is one single word, loitering. And before it was the registry. That was the word. So it was also not about the children. It was about the registry, and then became loitering. So the children are center stage, but something else happens. So yes, I would imagine social media has conventions. There is a doctoral student of ours at the University of Toronto who's doing some work on the use of social media by children in residential settings and how the staff, who are a different generation than the children by definition, do not know what to do with it. So they try to forbid social media. But these children or these young people are already not connected with the outside because they're in a residential setting. So they're trying to connect with social media, and you say, no social media. So what are we doing? And the staff really don't know what to do because they're trying to protect the children from some of the negative effects of some of the circulation of particular kinds of images and exploitation of images of children. But at the same time, they're sort of blocking all sorts of other possibilities because they themselves do not have the norms of how does one do this. And so what she's trying to do is to engage staff into a discussion about what would be the norms of how could we develop, how could we learn, how could we engage with this differently, and engage the young people as well into the conversation. So it's an interesting set of questions. About the dangers of photography, the beauty and the dangers of photography, and what photography is allowed to do or not allowed to do. We know this from, for instance, the American photographers, media who were embedded into the military. Embedded meaning they were kind of told, this is what you're going to see and this is what you're going to be showing. And they can try to create a variant of sorts, but this is what they show and not something else. So the problem of embedding is who is creating the story. Right? And the journalist may think, well, I'm going to do it differently. In spite of what they say, I'm going to show another side. Maybe, what other side? But the other sides they will not be able to show because they simply will not be allowed to go there. Right? So there's something about, and I had something else on my mind, detention centers. I saw a very interesting exhibit done by a graduate student as a graduating work in Toronto in the Department of Architecture about detention centers. And because she said, I cannot go in and take photographs. So how can I represent the materiality, if you want, of the detention center? So she looked at the regulation of the space. How much space is there in a room in the detention center? How many people? What are the windows? And she recreates kind of the mapping of how many square meters one person or square feet one person is allowed or a family is allowed. Are there windows? Are there bars on the windows? All of that trajectory of the material space. She compares it to prison systems. So you have the regulation of prison systems. You have the federal prison system, which is one way in Canada, and you have the provincial system that's a different. And the cots and the bed, and something that's tied to the bed, and what do you have, what don't you have? And so she starts to compare. And then she compares it to something, talk about regulation, like studio apartments today. They're creating micro studios now, mini spaces that you can actually put people in. Or you have these new projects of homeless people in containers. So she measures what's a container, what do we mean, and how much is that, and what is the height, and what is the light. And it's absolutely formidable. Like it is unbearable. So you do not have the photograph, but you have the graphic representation, because as an architect, that's what she creates the design. She reproduces the design that is usually in text. She reproduces it visually. And you have a sense that you are into that space. And it is unbearable. And that's exactly what she wants to show. And you go from one diagram to another diagram to another diagram, and you want to get out of there. But that's the exhibit. That's exactly the point. So there are visual means which can take all sorts of different forms, and which are also material, which are extremely, extremely powerful. Okay.
Thank you so much. I just wanted one very quick observation on that. As you were talking about that, I was thinking, what a powerful tool, educative tool this could be as well. I mean, I don't know to an extent. I'm looking to Denise, who's one of our sort of leaders in this area, but the many ways in which you've shown us that the kind of the use of and the causing us to question how we make images and how we respond to images and understand them as a window partly on ourselves as well as what we're seeing is would be another fantastic area to think of, I think, in educating.
Well, you can create projects through visual means.
So lots of thank you so much.
Well,
Lots and lots of
questions.
yes, it was important.